Here's another game I played in my youth, kind of underrated I feel. It's been sort of overshadowed by Bloodlines, which is a great game, but a different genre. So speaking of genres, this one's kind of weird by today's standards. It's a party action RPG. You control multiple characters, but it's real time without pause. So the camera is locked to the selected character and there's no strategy view, so it's like Dragon Age 2 that way, but again without a pause button. Instead, your party mates have 3 different AI settings: aggressive, neutral, and defensive, neither of which make them particularly intelligent. They will constantly blow their blood pool, which is mana in this game, on random spells, and pathfinding is clunky and awkward as well. So you find yourself losing engagements because your guys can't quite get to the enemy. And then also your characters generally miss a lot, which makes combat not very satisfying. One alternative design choice for that would be to lower the damage to make it more consistent, but that might even emphasize the boringness of those long engagements. Another alternative is to have lots of enemies that drop quickly, but that would be incompatible with the small-ish levels of the game. Speaking of which, that's one thing I like about this game. The dungeons are all bespoke rather than modular, so they don't feel like they're assembled from prefab rooms or whatever. Even though you always use prefabs to some degree, right? Which makes the dungeons feel more, quote-unquote, genuine, if you will. Like it's more valuable content. Also, I think it makes the world feel more consistent in a way. You know, you're not stepping into a game mechanic, as it were, when you're entering a dungeon. Anyway, so on character stats, there's a bunch of them, and I don't know what they do because there's no tooltips when you mouse over them. It's a clunky kind of old world interface. What can you do? Anyway, there's one stat that's manipulation that lowers vendor prices and raises the amount you get from selling items. And once you hit like 85 or 90 something, you will get more money from selling items than you pay for them. So that's a neat trick if you have some time for busy work, because you can't right click to sell. You have to select the item and click another button, and you can only use items that are in infinite supply for that trick, and those tend to not make you all that much money with each sale. And you have to dump a bunch of XP into that stat in the first place, so that's a considerable sacrifice. Now, I always like those kind of semi-exploits. It's like a meta mechanic that gives the gameplay another dimension, given that it's not so egregious as to break the whole experience, right? And it's born from a simple mechanic that is left unrestrained, which may be the best way to implement such mechanics, rather than artificially capping and clamping everything. So maybe that's generally a decent design approach when you're considering how a mechanic could be driven to the extreme, to go, okay, how do we accommodate that? Or how do we keep the overall gameplay viable without just plonking an invisible wall in there? If that makes sense. So about the game world, it's based on the World of Darkness pen and paper RPG framework, so it has a whole mythology of lore to draw from, which gives it a lot of depth from the get-go. It has this whole vampire genealogy, where the biblical Cain is the originator of the entire vampire bloodline, whatever way the concept of a bloodline really is supposed to work in this context, seeing as vampires don't really reproduce. At any rate, it roots vampirism in the mythological history of the human species, which has all sorts of spiritual and psychological implications. So this genealogy evolved into vampire clan politics, which you're introduced to in the game, and there are a number of vampire clans, and they each have their own character and approach to their condition and their interactions with the mortal world. So there's value in having established lore and an established gameplay system, like all the stats and rolls and stuff. But I'm not sure that the latter always translates perfectly to video games, especially if it's a real-time system and one with that wonky of a pathfinding system at that, where characters can dodge fireballs and stuff like that. You also have all these stats that seem redundant in a game that's mainly about combat, where the whole story and character interaction aspect is linear. I imagine things like charisma are more relevant in a pen and paper context. In this game, you need different stats to unlock different kinds of spells, but I'm not sure how else these stats are relevant, for the most part. Then there's the constant missing and critical hits, which enemies can deal as well. That's something I had in my game, Slasher's Keep. Enemies dealing critical hits, but I took it out because it's just frustrating. So you can deal critical hits, but enemies can't. Anyway, in this game, Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, your characters can fail healing spells too, which just feels stupid. I assume that's also a holdover from the pen and paper system. I think in a real-time system, these kinds of spreadsheet mechanics are hard to get right in such a way that they enhance the experience and don't take you out of it. It's funny how the follow-up game, Bloodlines, strayed further away from its pen and paper origins and became basically a Deus Ex-like FPS. Anyway, having blood for mana is an interesting quirk too. It's like mana, but not quite, in that you can replenish it from friends, foes, and civilians. If you try it on enemies in combat, you will have to make them docile via some spell first, or be very lucky. But once you've grabbed them and started sucking, they'll need someone else to get you off of them. The same goes for your guys when they get grabbed, so that stuff is quirky. But the AI will stop sucking before the victim dies though, whether it's an enemy or a civilian, so you'll have to switch to that character if you want to suck someone dry. I admit there's an uncomfortable amount of AI wrangling in this game, and it seems to be diametrically opposed to the design sometimes. Like in this level where you have to stay in the shadows so as not to get burned by the sun, but your party members aren't quite wise to that mechanic, so you have to set them to stay and then manually maneuver them all one by one. You know what strikes me about the lore as well, just to cycle back to that again, is the whole concept of having a parallel society that works alongside or underneath IRL society. That's like real escapism. It's like, what if all this nonsense we're living through really was as inconsequential as it is inane, and the real important stuff was happening in secret? It's similar to the spy thriller genre, where you have agents acting outside the law of the land and instead they're concerned with the laws of realpolitik and immediate physicality. Except with this vampire stuff, it's not just realpolitik, it's a whole nother moral framework that also has a spiritual component. And it's tied to the sense of eternity that religion provides, but in a more immediate way, seeing as the characters involved are potentially immortal. So the time frames of their concerns can potentially stretch across time indefinitely. Reminds me of the intro to The Lord of the Rings. You know, history became legend, legend became myth. In that you have the elves sort of taking the role that vampires take here, except they're not inherently predatory towards mortals. They're the opposite, really. Like anti-vampires. The able to their Cain, in a way. Deep stuff, that. So, speaking of immortality, here's something that's kind of a spoiler, if you ask me. Not so much if you've already seen a bunch of footage from the game, but if you don't want to be spoiled, go to this timecode. So in the middle of the game, the main character gets buried under a bunch of rubble, which renders him comatose, and then he wakes back up in modern day, and this blew me away as a kid. I thought the game was over at that point, and then the setting changed completely. Now there's guns and stuff, and the story goes on, and you're now no longer a mere whelp. You're now hot stuff because you're ancient, and you meet some new people and some old friends. Anyway, this stuff was wild for me back then. I'd love it if more games had this kind of hidden flip side, you know? Of course, that stuff works best if you allow yourself no exposure to a game before playing, so you'd have to gamble to an extent. I remember having that feeling with a couple of open world games that sprung a second map on you in the middle of the story. Anyway, I like how people in this game talk all King James-like and old-timey.
The splendor of the Lord rains down upon thee, Christoph. I give thee this wrought silver cross for thy labors.
I would hear all thou knowest of vampire lore.
When I was a kid, I played the game in German, so this was new to me. Very charming. You know, I think this game may also have a bit of that quote-unquote Central European grit I mentioned in my Gothic video, if only on account of the fact that it starts you out in Prague. So the setting has some old world realness you don't tend to get in modern fantasy. The lore also draws heavily from Judeo-Christian mythology, obviously, what with the Cain and Abel story, and then you have stuff like a renegade golem in the Jewish quarter in Prague. Story-wise, the drive for your main character is a love story with this nun who nurses you at the start of the game. There isn't a whole lot of chemistry between the two, just kind of dorky but charming professions of deep love. Then she gets taken away and defiled by demons in a deep spiritual biblical sense, because those are the themes that are incarnated in this type of fiction, right? Heavy stuff. So there's a clear motivation for the main character that everyone can understand, and it's still a more believable romance than what you get in modern RPGs, where every party member is a potential slam piece if you just give them enough gifts or choose the conversation options with the little heart symbol or whatever. So, in conclusion, I loved this game when I was a kid. Then later I learned on the internet that it sucked. 'Tis ever the way of the internet, isn't it? And the popular opinion about any given piece of media is a powerful thing. But these kinds of games, the ones we have fond memories of, I think can teach us something about those kinds of opinions. You know, people read Steam reviews or watch reviews on YouTube and take other people at their word. but really people value different things about games, right? Depending on their personality or their associations with certain settings or other aspects. Maybe they have skewed expectations based on other games they played before the one they're playing now. Stuff like that. And they may not be aware of what's happening, so they just malign the game based on a couple of flaws and talk them up like they're make or break issues. I mean, it's the literally unplayable meme, right? And then you may not be able to assess whether or not you would like the game, because to you those flaws might not be all that egregious. Also, people tend to overplay their emotions on the internet. Speaking of the internet, it always seemed to me like the history of the internet, that is social media and whatnot, has been the history of the millennial generation growing up. So you had this whole phase when people bonded over bashing things they consumed when they were younger. Like there was a time when everybody was ragging on action movies, presumably to present themselves as sophisticated. You know, because they're adults now. And some of those opinions stuck. It's only recently that people seem to have been reassessing those opinions. Possibly in light of the tripe that goes for modern cinema. Anyway, with this game, Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, I can see why people would dislike it. The clunky pathfinding, awkward controls, and the somewhat unsatisfying combat all do test your patience, and today you really have lots of options to switch to. Back in the day, you bought a new game once in a blue moon, so you would make damn sure you got the most out of it. So you just accepted whatever jank you would have to work through for that. Now, I like the game for its immersive fiction, the lore, and how your character progression ties into it, and all the blood magic that was kind of unorthodox at the time, I think. Then there's ways of gaming the system, which has a special kind of appeal, like the manipulation stat. I mean, it's mainly that, but there are more ways of gaming the jank, which are cute. Then there's this feeling of constant content with the handcrafted dungeons, which is normal for like FPS, but felt unusual to me in an isometric RPG kind of thing. Now, come to think of it, Baldur's Gate and games like that did that, right? Albeit not in 3D. You know what? I remember liking that about Baldur's Gate 2 as well when I played that back in the day. Having pre-rendered set pieces for levels rather than like a grid-based thing, you know? Anyway, so this is an old-timey kind of blend of action RPG and story-driven party RPG. Clunky and old, but still thoroughly playable. But don't just go and buy it. Buy my game instead. Slasher's Keep is a first-person roguelike with a focus on melee combat and loot. It has randomly generated dungeons with orcs, mole rats, and other monsters to fight, lots of loot to find, and a drag-and-drop weapon crafting system. I made it all by my lonesome, and it's available for PC on Steam.